Great. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you, Ruben, and thank you, Sophie and Elizabeth, for the incredible film that you all created together. I still think back to what a great educational tool it is for teaching people about deepfakes and the effect that they have on normal people's lives. I think there is this, prevailing understanding that deepfakes only affect people like Taylor Swift, but obviously the film does such a great job of telling a story that is contrary to the one that we hear in the media very frequently. So I encourage you all to watch it. My name is Nina Jankowicz. I'm an author and disinformation researcher. I have been an advocate for victims of online harms, including deepfake pornography, for quite a while. And last summer, I discovered that I myself am a victim of deepfake porn. So this issue has become all the more actual and important for me. And I've been very happy to support the film as it's been making its way around the world. And I'm super thrilled to be here today with really an all-star legendary panel of people who are moving and shaking in the space of pushing back on deepfake pornography. I'm going to let them introduce themselves because I think it is bad for somebody who's moderating a virtual panel to talk too much, and I've already crossed that line. So I'm going to call on each of them to tell us a little bit about themselves and how their work intersects with the world of non-consensual intimate imagery or deepfake pornography. So I'm going to start in the top left of my screen. I've got Nia Batts. Nia, welcome. Can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Thank you so much for having me. My name is Nia Batts. I spent the majority of my career actually in-house at what's now Paramount Global, overseeing strategic partnerships and social impact. Did a bit of a transition from entertainment into venture investing, and I serve as general partner of a Michigan-based venture capital firm at Union Heritage Ventures. I believe that my business partner, Sophia Bush, also participated yesterday. We're really excited to be here, and this is an issue that's incredibly important for us as tech investors, as lifelong activists for women and children. We understand that we have the opportunity with our investments to spur innovation, to invest in solutions that are technological solutions that are going to benefit humanity, but also the responsibility to advocate for guardrails to make sure that groups of people that have traditionally been kind of the most at risk are protected. And so we're excited to be here at the summit this year, the first virtual summit on deepfake abuse, and to learn, but also kind of offer some of our perspectives. So thank you so much.
Yeah, and we look forward to hearing some of those perspectives today. Georgia Bullen, over to you, please.
Hi, everybody. I'm Georgia Bullen. I'm the executive director at Superbloom Design. We are a nonprofit that's focusing on changing who technology serves by using design as the intervention lever. What I mean by that is we do projects that are around sort of creating critical alternative, like exploring alternative interventions of how something could be created. We use design practice as a way to change who's in the room and who gets to shape what things look like, and overall trying to shift design practice and how products get built and things of that nature. So yeah, it's great to be here. I'm excited to talk about ideas and ways that we can be co-designing a better future.
Wonderful. And last but not least, Hany Farid.
Nice to be with you all. My name is Hany. I'm on the faculty here at the University of California, Berkeley. By training, I'm an applied mathematician and computer scientist, and I spend most of my days developing techniques to detect. Today, we call them deep fakes. We used to call them digital forgeries. And along the way, I also think about both policy and technological interventions to combat many of the harmful things that we have seen arising over the last 20 years while harnessing many of the powers of this technology and the internet.
Yes, Hany has been a key force in kind of pushing back on a lot of the AI doomerism, but also bringing really important perspectives to the conversation for the past several years, but especially over the last year, as we've heard so many headlines that have been wildly inaccurate about AI and misstating the harms that are created. All right, so today we're here to talk about tech and what tech can do to solve the deepfake porn problem. I think there is a lot of frustration among survivors, among groups of marginalized communities, particularly women's groups and women of color, who feel like we've seen this movie before, that you know, we have experienced the harms of social media. We have been bearing the brunt of them, that our qualms were not listened to, nothing is changing, and that history is repeating itself. So I'm hopeful that today we can have a little bit more of an optimistic conversation, and hopefully we've got some folks in the audience who can put these things into practice. So the first question for each of you, and then we'll kind of get into a more detailed discussion as we go on, is what's your top intervention for the tech industry to make an end to deepfake porn? Let's start with Georgia, since her company is so focused on building the tech we want to see in the world.
Yeah, I think, I mean, my top, I was like, I have many, but my top answer to that is, I mean, we really need to, we've said this, so fundamentally, right, what we practice is human-centered design, but the reality is how this plays out is that there aren't the humans who are actually impacted by these things involved in shaping that design. And I think we really need to find ways to enable interactions and sort of co-design activity, or like validation and testing. Like, there's many ways that we can involve impacted communities in shaping how these systems actually work, and how, like, the points where that lead to the problems, like what could be different about those moments. And I think the other factor I would put in here, a key point to me, is that we have more transparency around the fact that that is happening, so that we can have this accountability around, like, no, you didn't listen, and this didn't solve the problem, and we're still seeing it, and here's why. So being able to see that feedback loop, but fundamentally it's actually hearing from the communities and having that, like, actually shape the direction of the way a lot of these platforms and tools work.
Absolutely, absolutely. I was recently at a summit on responsible AI, and the room was extremely white and extremely upper class. And we noted, some of us there, that the lack of kind of marginalized communities represented, and the lack of labor representation too, which is a huge issue when we're talking about training deepfake models. Hany, over to you. What's your top intervention? I know it's hard to pick just one.
Yeah, I'm gonna abuse my the microphone for a second. Just say I'm gonna tell you the top one, but let me tell you, we should go after the abusers. We should go after the AI tech companies that are enabling their technology to be used either knowingly or unknowingly. We should be going after the people hosting this material, the social media companies who allow this stuff and profit from it. We should go after our regulators and the courts to hold those responsible. All of those are at the top of my list, but here's the big one. I tend to think of this problem as where is the smallest choke point, right? Because if we try to go after the abusers, this is the mother of all whack-a-mole games, right? You're going to go after millions and millions of people who are creating this. So where's the choke point? And so these days, what I've been thinking about is taking the money out of the system. Because if you go to these websites today that say, take clothes off of women, nudify women, create the images you always wanted to, at the very bottom, you will see things like Visa, MasterCard, American Express, PayPal. Take the money out of the system, demonetize these services. Why are there ads running on there? So get the ads out of it, get the financial services out of it. I don't think that, by the way, solves the problem, but it takes the profit margin out. And then, then we start going after the other thing. So right now, that's my sort of top choke point. And here's the other thing I like about this. This is easy. We actually know how to do this. We know how to go after the financial services. We know how to go to, and because we've done it. We've done it with Backpage. We've done it with Pornhub. We've done it with other services, and it actually works. When you take the financial incentive out of it, we can get people to move and change their behaviors.
Absolutely, absolutely. And last but not least, over to Nia.
Yeah, I really have to, echo these 2 points. Sophia and I were really proud to join Sophie, Ruben, and Elizabeth, the team that made the film Another Body, as executive producers. And we were incredibly struck by the story of the protagonist. And as people who've really advocated for more women in tech, it was incredibly discouraging to us to see, to really learn the story of someone who has been victimized. And so, as investors in the AI and machine learning space, we pay really close attention to how models are trained. And that really comes back to the people and the organizations who train them and the intent behind them. And so just wanted to kind of elevate Georgia's point as well. Also coming from ad-supported cable and understanding, the ecosystem around content development and distribution, and everything that Hany said. what we have to make sure that we do is figure out the ways in which there's economic pressure that is put on these companies so that they begin to make better decisions. You know, frankly, from an investing standpoint, and this is often what happens because our job is to invest in the future, our job is to promote innovation. It's that this happens very quickly and we don't have the opportunity to really create the legislative guardrails that are going to protect folks along the way. You know, in my time at Paramount, we had a kids and family group and had to be really sensitive to COPA compliance laws. We had to really think intentionally about how to build and grow our audience and businesses, but do that in a way that also protected them as well. And I think that there are some baseline opportunities to do just that.
Absolutely. And I know there's other sessions today talking about legislation and policy making. So I don't want us to go too far down that path, but I do foot stomp everything Hany and Nia have said about regulation and the fact that we don't have, you know, as the United States of America, this problem is not that new. We've been talking about it for about 8 years now, the deepfake porn problem. And our legislators have been ignoring it, pretty much just ignoring it. We've got 10 states that have, you know, state laws on the books, but they're all civil as well, no criminal penalties, and mostly just looking at the amplification of these deepfakes rather than looking at the creation of them. So let's get to the question about monetization, since we've heard from two of our panelists about that, and then I've got another question about culpability in the tech industry itself that I'd like to get to. So Hany, you talked about ads. You just talked about the economic incentives, Nia. A lot of teens right now are getting served ads for notification apps and other kind of deepfake porn, easy to make, either kind of image-based apps or full-on video apps. And we've seen instances, most notably in New Jersey, of underage girls being targeted with this stuff by their classmates. To me, this seems like a fairly simple fix, right? But can you guys walk us through what that would look like in practice? Like, how do we use those economic levers? Do we just ban advertising to kids about this? What are the ways that we do it? Let's throw that over to Nia first, and then we can open it up.
Yeah, it's tough because, I mean, we live in a capitalist-based system, right? So you have these companies that truly are generating a significant amount of revenue, you know, on the advertising, on the hosting, and so there are sort of many factors at play that certainly need to be addressed. You know, I continue to go back to, you know, the idea of fighting for the victims and allowing there to be some sort of economic recompense, because I really do think that that's the type of societal pressure that, frankly, we need to put on these companies whose products and services we use in a myriad of ways that certainly outweigh, even though it's a very large economic kind of benefit which they are accruing, like, to their bottom line. So I think there has to be more transparency in the conversation. And I think that there has to be, on some level, you know, some of the fear that they must feel with having widespread individual or class action sort of lawsuits around this issue. Like, I try to be optimistic, and at the same point, I think that this type of pressure is really necessary as we kind of move forward with the rate and speed of technology that, again, is moving so quickly that businesses are going to have to adjust as well. And I know that we're not talking about the legislative elements of it, but I worry that we're not, or these tech companies are not making the decisions to act in the best interest of humanity. I think that a lot of them feel that the products and services that they offer provide a greater benefit than some of the risks of them. And we have to really do the work of showing up in spaces like this, of having conversations like this, to make sure that you know, that parents, that business owners, that everyone that comes into play with this type of intimate image abuse realizes and really recognizes that they have a responsibility and some agency to really speak up. And so I think the societal pressure will hopefully help inform the business conversation, but ultimately I do feel like we need to have some more formal corrections to really make sure that we're protecting those that have been the most impacted.
Sure. Hany, I want to throw it over to you and also ask about app stores and the fact that so many of these apps that are just easily democratizing, providing accessible ways to nudify women
Yeah.
are just plainly available on app stores.
Good.
Any thoughts about that,
Well,
or the other question?
Yeah, the App Store is an easier one. And I think Nia's right. The banning of ads is a complicated equation just because of the nature of capitalism. But the App Store is easy because it's not, you don't even have to pass a law. It's the rule already. Apple bans all kinds of apps that don't allow this. They just have to enforce their terms of service more aggressively. They control everything. Google controls everything, and we should be putting pressure on them to just simply enforce their rules. We don't actually have to pass new rules. It's a gift. I think Nia's right that on banning ads, unfortunately, the genie's out of the bottle. Kids know that this stuff exists. They're seeing it on Reddit. They're seeing it on Discord. They're seeing it in their chat. So sure, let's try to limit the spread of telling even more people about it. But I think the reality is that is already, it's well past us. So I'm all for it. I'm also for example, I just tried this morning, just before this panel, I went over to Google yet again. I do this every few weeks, and I searched, how do you make deep fake nudes of women? And it gleefully surfaces dozens and dozens of web pages. I'm like, why are you surfacing that, right? So this stuff, sure, do the ads, but the Google search is there. Get rid of the Google. There's a Discord channel. And so that's a bit of a whack-a-mole. But I'm all for it, but I think we have to also look elsewhere.
Georgia, go ahead. Yeah.
I would say, if I can jump in here, I think these are places where, to come back to thinking about what are the design interventions, I think we, maybe we think about UX design and things like that, or like opportunities for design, and we think about the actual products themselves, but we can also think about the App Store user experience. Like, what are friction points that could be introduced to help people report apps that are bad? Like, how can we actually collectively inform these are problems and enable the terms of service to be applied, right, more aggressively? Like, that can be a feedback loop of like informing what those signals are, maybe before you install an app, saying like, we've had some reports about, like, how do we surface these opportunities, similar to, what we saw on Twitter a few years ago, which was like, do you want to repost this? Or you haven't clicked on the link. Are you sure you want to repost it? Like, that's a point of friction that enables a person to say, do I want, question what they're doing, and slows some of the virality of those interactions, right? So how can we do that in app stores better? Like, how can we think about these use cases as part of the design of the App Store experience, as part of the design of the search experience? And that, again, comes back to like actually engaging people who are who are doing these things, right? And considering these as use cases. It's far too easy to focus on like the good use cases that we want to have happen, but we have to change our framework for design to involve the risks to, we're saying marginalized populations, but like, if women are, if we're saying that half of the world's population identifies as marginalized, like, it's more than half, right? Like, but even if we just said women, like, it's an everyone problem. Like, this is not an edge case situation. It's an everyone problem, and everyone can be affected by this, because even if you are not someone who identifies as a woman, you probably know someone who does, right? Like, this is not an edge situation anymore. Like, these need to be a part of our everyday practices.
Yes, I mean, you'd think so, and yet I was I got a Google alert yesterday morning quoting me saying that deepfake porn was a problem. I guess this man was unaware that I had been victimized by deepfake porn, but the entire thesis of his article was that deepfakes are here to stay and there's nothing we can do about them, right? I'm sure he would feel differently if his wife or his daughter were.
I would say, let's create some of him and see how he's so casual about
I have
it.
been saying this, a little bit flippantly, but that is, if some
I'm not flippant at all about it. Give me his name.
Yeah, I gave a talk a few years ago at a design conference, and I sort of escalated the personas I was presenting from, maybe what might be more of an edge case of like, maybe you don't day to day think about the LGBTQ organizer in Uganda who's fighting for like LGBTQ rights, right, in your design process. But my final persona, so I went through 5, that's part of this project, called the Usable Project, from the internet freedom space. And I got to the final one and I said, or like being a woman on the internet. And there was an audible, oh shit, in the audience, like, pardon my language, but there was an audible, like, no one had that moment. But that was 2020, first of all. Like, that was early 2020. Like, this isn't new, as we've been saying. And people came up to me afterwards and they said, you're right. Like, I'm not doing this in my practice. I need to change my practice. And I'm like, we need to push, we need to ask people to be a part of bringing change collectively. Like, it's our responsibility to understand the potential things that could go wrong from the stuff that we're designing, right?
Sure.
And
Mhm.
have that dialogue more.
Yeah, I mean, I was also going to say, and I love that you were sort of talking through these different personas and use cases to sort of draw a connection to the audience. But yeah, so we talk about celebrities, right? Like the Taylor Swift case, and we talk about these famous YouTubers, and but it's politicians, but it's really everyday people, everyday women who are the most affected. And then you start to see these, digital forums where like doxing is happening, and it's creating like true safety and security risks for people as well. And so in addition to the emotional impact, like there is like the threat of physical and bodily harm that we also have to account for in this conversation.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of understanding of online harms in kind of parallel tracks, but not an understanding that these things are often happening kind of globally to an individual. So for me, it wasn't just deepfake porn, it was doxing, it was violent threats that were happening against me, it was a kind of broad media campaign against me, and it was all mutually reinforcing. And I think in that context is so important in making change with the tech companies. So Hany, you mentioned search engines, and we've kind of touched on this a little bit. I had the experience a couple of weeks ago around Women's Day. I was on a panel hosted by Columbia University talking about my experience with deepfake porn and other online abuse, and also my research about it. And one of the deepfake porn videos of me is me and Hillary Clinton and Greta Thunberg. You can fill in the blanks there. Hillary happened to be in the audience that day, and I got to kind of joke about the fact that I found out about this from a Google alert. The reason I even know the deepfake porn of me exists is because Google indexed and cached and sent a Google alert to me along with, whatever NPR hit had happened that day. The fact that you can search my name in deepfake porn and stuff comes up is just baffling to me. So what do we need to do? I mean, obviously, My Image, My Choice, Another Body Film, all of us who are here today are doing our best to put pressure on the companies. What else needs to happen so that Google and Bing and all of these search engines and internet service providers are not willfully, gleefully surfacing this content to users who are looking for it?
Yeah.
Hany, I see Hany nodding. Let's go over to you.
Okay, so look, the fact is that there are technological interventions, and we know this. So let me give you a couple of examples. In the very beginning of Facebook and YouTube, those two companies decided they didn't actually want to, they were going to ban legal adult pornography, right? Perfectly protected speech. I always love, by the way, Mark Zuckerberg tells us how much he loves the First Amendment. And then the first thing he did was ban protected speech. Please. Okay, but here's the thing. Why did they do it? They did it because it was bad for their business, because they knew if they allowed adult legal pornography, that's all that would be there, and the advertisers would go away. So what did they do? They developed tech to find this material, and they're actually not that bad at it. Okay. YouTube did the same thing. And then here's another example. In the early days before the DMCA, the Digital Millennial Copyright Act, all the big tech companies said, we can't possibly stop the spread of copyright infringing. And if you do this, you will destroy the internet. It was a big fat lie. We passed DMCA. We created a healthier ecosystem. We still have a problem, don't get me wrong, with creators being paid for their services, but they got really good at this. And so when there's a financial incentive or there is pressure from regulation or liability, they're pretty good at it, right? And so we have to simply change the calculus, right? And so right now, the tech companies are simply not incentivized to help you, to help even Taylor Swift for that matter, let alone somebody who doesn't have their $5,000 an hour lawyers to help them. And so we have to change the incentives. We have to create liability. We have to reform Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act that says you don't get off the hook just because you're a tech company, and watch how smart and how fast these companies will pivot. Change the financial incentives. And that's it. And we can do this. And we have a history of this. We have a history of this, in fact, in the physical space. When we started creating more liability for people who created physical products that they knew or should have known would harm us, products got safer. Right. And so I think we just have to change the calculus. It's not fundamentally a technological problem. It's not that they can't do this. It's they're simply, not only are they not incentivized, they're actually making a lot of money by not doing it. And so we just have to change the calculus. That's it.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And another analogy is often thrown out there is it's terrorist content, right? We see that the platforms are using hash tracking. So for those that are not, technological in the audience, every image or video has a unique hash on the kind of inside of it in its bones. The companies are able to use that to identify instances of that image proliferating across the internet. Of course, if the image is altered in some ways, then it gets a new hash, and there are issues with that. But this is how they take down violent terrorist content or other kind of illegal content that proliferates on the platforms. And certainly they could do that with deepfake porn as well. And we've actually got a very good question about this, actually 2 questions in our Q&A. We've got one from Lee and one from Cecile, both on similar points. So Lee says, systems like Stop NCAI work, non-consensual intimate imagery work and also don't work. What would you say about when companies seem to hide behind these systems so they get a pass when it comes to timely removals? So that's the first question. And the second one from, Cecily, not Cecile, my mistake, is that a lot of focus has been put on the takedown processes and keeping harmful content down. Hany already mentioned, this process is going to be like playing whack-a-troll. It's unending. Why do we think the tech giants don't want to solve the problem at their root, that is preventing the abuse before it starts? So I think we've had some answers alluded to here. Let's throw it to Georgia to kick us off.
Yeah, one thing I want to name that I'm thinking about and how I've been describing like the role that design can play or the role that folks who are the makers of the technology can play is I do want to be clear, I'm not suggesting we've made recycling an individual narrative, like we individually can save the world by recycling as opposed to taxing the companies that create the things that we need to recycle. Like I kind of, where I'm going with this, if it makes sense, is I think we have an opportunity to mobilize as a labor force making these tools and also be another voice of influence and intervention and power. So given that the incentives are broken, as has been discussed, and that those need to get pushed on in various ways, I also think we need to say, as people involved in the making of these products, what can we organize and change, right? How can we stand up and say, we haven't done this responsibly. We need to involve these folks. Like, we need to test for these use cases. And some of that comes from knowing that these are problems. So it's an education problem. Some of it, an advocacy problem. Some of it comes from like just making that the priority, saying like, we haven't completed the feature. We haven't finished our OKRs until we've done these things that allow us to say, we've considered these harms. We've considered how we're addressing these harms as part of our work. So I think we did a project a few years ago with the Web Foundation and like hundreds of global stakeholders around deceptive design, dark patterns, and trying to shift towards a trusted design, norm building interventions. And we have some ideas there that we put together, which is really, a lot of it's about product practice shifts. But I see that as both a direct intervention on ways that we can make these experiences better and work better and scale, but also an opportunity to really shift practice and mobilize as a labor force that can have power, right? Like I think we need to recognize that we can have power and we should take it in those opportunities.
That's really inspiring. Other folks have answers to the question about takedowns and kind of following the content as it proliferates online. And I'm not sure if this got covered yesterday for those that are tuning in today, but one of the problems with deepfake pornography is that it goes up somewhere and is often copied on multiple other websites that then, even if you get the first piece of content taken down, and this has happened in my case, actually the individual who created it removed it himself proactively, probably because I wrote about it in The Atlantic and he thought he was about to get sued, but it has proliferated to a number of other websites. So what do we do in those situations, and how do we incentivize a better system for the tech giants to address it?
I can chime in a little bit on the tech side to answer Lee's question, and I think it's the right question, and I think they're absolutely right that it sort of works and it doesn't work. So here's the thing, is detecting something that has been previously identified, whether it's NCII, whether it's child abuse imagery, whether it's terrorist activity, is simply easier than trying to say, is this non-consensual intimate imagery, which is this very hard thing to figure out. You got to figure out, what is the identity? Did the person consent to that? How am I going to figure that out? Whereas if once, Nina, you tell me this is non-consensual, boom, I grab a perceptual hash, a robust hash, whatever the signature is, and then I can stop the proliferation. It doesn't deal with the problem in its entirety, but it sort of helps prevent the redistribution. So it's just technologically more feasible than trying to look at every single piece of content to the billions of uploads every day and make really hard decisions. And then number two is a lot of the technology that is being used to create this stuff. Yes, you go to a web service and you put your credit card in, and we should go after those creators. That's at the source. But I have code on my laptop right here that can create this type of content. And what somebody does in the privacy of their home on their laptop, I can't regulate that. I can't control that. All I can do is, once I identify that, stop the reproliferation. That's not a great answer, by the way. It's a terrible answer, but we're not going to stop the creation of this, and because it is going to happen in the dark corners of the internet on people's personal laptops. But I do have a chance, thanks to the types of perceptual hashing technology that have been developed over the decades, to at least stop the distribution. And by the way, that puts pressure downstream, right? If you create things but you can't distribute them, they keep getting knocked down, your accounts keep getting deleted. That then puts pressure that, there's no point in doing this. We're going to knock this down.
Yeah, I was in another interesting discussion recently that kind of stopped me in my tracks. I was with a bunch of developers, and I had never personally entertained the idea of culpability for developers themselves as a potential solution to this. And here was this, imagine a tech bro, but not an American tech bro. So like long hair, like kind of baggy clothes, that sort of tech bro. You've all got him in your mind. I was shocked when he got up at this conference and said, we need the culpability to go all the way upstream to the developers. And I'm sure many of my brothers in arms will, string me up for saying this, but that's what I believe needs to happen. Because if you're putting open source code on the internet that can be used and modified to then nudify somebody, I believe you need to be held responsible for thinking about and iterating the ways in which that code can be used to harm. So I'm wondering, Georgia, Hany, do you agree with that? Is that something that when we're talking about regulation, and I recognize this is a regulatory question, but it's within the tech space, that we should be thinking about? Or is there a code of conduct among developers that could be put forward? I don't know how that would be enforced. That's not my world, but yeah, what can we do to kind of encourage that safety by design? Which, Georgia, this was a question for you in the Q&A from John. How can we start to prioritize that safety by design? You've talked about it a little bit.
Yeah, I think it gets tricky. Like the sort of directions around codes of conduct and codes of ethics, like there needs to be some mechanism of enforcement for any of these things. And I think that gets at like, what are we saying is the legal, what is the risk that we want to be from perpetrating these things, right? And from being like, but I guess making it that you also are named a perpetrator, right? To some extent, like if we can go after the perpetrators of the making of the videos, we also should go after the perpetrators of the development of the tools, right? And figure out some sort of, harms that, some sort of, I'm not coming up with a word, but some way of addressing that. And I think I do think that there's an opportunity there that we just need to play out. Like, I think we haven't been willing to consider it enough to say, like, what are the implications of that, right? I mean, another thing that I think could be interesting to look at is, where do we see safety by design happening and working well already? I was in a conversation earlier this year where we were talking about how do we govern AI and the changes in AI, and the woman who's Gemma Garcia Calderon, who's with Atticus AI, was saying, we have really effective safety systems in things like food safety. Like, we know how there are all these tools and things in place that allow us to go from like animal being farmed somewhere to, to food in a grocery store that someone buys. And we have ways to deal with culpability all through that pipeline. I think we need to bring a similar practice to technology, and that's happening in some places, but not here. And I think that's my question, is how do we close that gap, right? Like, how do we bring that same concept of the whole pipeline of safety to everything we're making and everything that enables us to get access to those things, right? So coming back to the app stores, the search interfaces, the tools themselves, like we have models for this. We just haven't been willing to bring them to bear in these situations. And that's what needs to change. And to the question of how do we start doing this, like we need to either make it a requirement, right, in some way, right, auditing or like regulatory, or we need to require it through mobilization of the labor force, so unions and things like that, that set policies, right, that then become like how these sort of systems play out. So it's like, what are the levers that we have to introduce change? A lever I think about a lot, and maybe it's to the liability point, is like, how do we make it really expensive to screw up, right? Like insurance should cost a lot if you're in this space, right? And it should keep costing more because we're not dealing with the harms we're creating. So, you know, it's got to be expensive to be doing it incorrectly.
Yeah, that's a lot there. Hany, anything to add that maybe Georgia didn't touch on?
Yeah, I'll tell you, a couple of years ago, as we were starting to see the rise of this nasty material, and it was being powered by, my colleagues in the academy who are developing technologies, really cool stuff. They're putting it out on GitHub, open source licenses, and then bad stuff happens. And I thought very sensibly said, hey, maybe in the review process and in the submission process, when we're submitting and publishing papers, there should just be a box that says, are there ethical considerations that need to be thought of here? Not do it, don't do it, not ban it, don't ban it. Just let's have a conversation. And you can't imagine the vitriol that came from that. You're stifling innovation, you're anti-tech, and I thought, man, if this is the response from otherwise very reasonable and thoughtful people, that doesn't bode well. Having said that, I don't think we want to go as far as say, if anybody develops any tech that anybody uses in a bad way, you're held culpable. That obviously will have a chilling fact. But I think there are different degrees here. I think if you did something and had an unintended consequences or was used in a way that was unpredictable, I don't think anybody's on the hook for that. But I think if you develop something that clearly has a very small leap to being misused, I think there should be some amount of accountability. And I think that has to start with us in the academy holding ourselves responsible at the submission, at the review, and at the distribution side of things. And absolutely. Now, whether that maps over to actual liability in courts of law, I think we have to tread lightly there, because I would be concerned about a chilling effect on innovation, on technology, and on science.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective and comes right to my next question, which is for Nia. This question's from Stephanie, and she asked, does the lightning speed at which tech is launched on the public, race to be first to market, contribute to the lack of more robust design interventions and having more voices at the table in their development? So as a VC, Nia, what are you looking for in the sorts of things that you're funding in order to have kind of a safer, more inclusive design process? And do you think Stephanie's right that race to be first to market is powering some of these harms?
I mean, I guess the short answer to that is yes, but that traditionally is how tech has advanced and how tech investors and these companies have made money. You have to kind of fail early and often has been sort of kind of this necessary part of the process, but also one that we have to be really intentional about. A lot of the companies that we look to invest in, whether, we look at what the AI and sort of machine learning implications are in their business model, and we're always looking for the usages of those technologies that improve the capacity of humans to make decisions. And so we come back to, speed, efficiency, and accuracy. How these attributes of AI and machine learning are built into their processes that make the product better. But ultimately, as women and, certainly as a woman of color, we look to make investments in companies that also have diverse teams, because we know that there's truly a diversity dividend. Over 60% higher valuations on exits for companies that have diverse team members. And so we know that this is quantifiable from an investment standpoint, but we realize that this also is because you're having different types of diverse viewpoints and decision makers that are involved in every step of the process. And so that's incredibly important, and even more so as we see these types of advancements in tech, but also how quick products are coming to market. A lot of our sort of AI machine learning investments in companies that specifically do this work have really been more in like B2B solutions. But, even when we go back to the conversation around sort of apps and these other types of technologies, even like the language that we're using for how we're marketing and disseminating these products is important. And so not only do we have to be involved in the development of these products, but also really thinking about the go-to-market strategy as investors and as a part of our diligence, asking good questions that are introducing conversations around guardrails or positionings, or understanding the responsibility as investors that we take if we're putting capital into these businesses. So there's lots of points in the process, I think, to one of George's earlier comments, to just creating friction. But I do think that friction is good when we're moving this quickly. And I think we have to all think about sort of the place that we sit in the ecosystem and the opportunity to just sort of slow things down individually until we have like a more collective response.
Thank you. Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
If I could jump onto that, there's a project that we supported a few years ago called RightsWise VC, and part of its goal was to try to help shift the practice in venture capital of what goes into those valuations, where we could bring in sort of a rights-based framework to that, like, and consider harms as part of the sort of VC process. And I'll admit to that is not a thing I know super well, so I will turn it back to you about how that might work. But it's the website is rightswise.vc. But the point there being like, what are interventions we could have in that funding ecosystem that could actually change what we are valuing that is enabling that speed, right? I think another project that's having influence from this perspective and the space is ranking digital rights. Like, how do we say, oh, these like, we need to be influencing why we think this company should get this amount of money to be able to move that quickly, right? Like, I would love for there to be more controls around that, of like, is it a diverse enough team? What is their plan for addressing diversity? I mean, those types of questions do get posed in grants and academic research, right? Like, how are you addressing diversity, equity, inclusion as part of your company, but also as part of your product approach, right? Like, how are you thinking about that? And it'd be great to, that as just like an example point, but I think that's another space where we could be changing the incentives, right?
Yeah, I mean, and that's great. And I want to certainly learn more about that. And also, I think what gets measured gets done, right? And so, when we make investments, we're not impact investors, but we are overwhelmingly concerned about the impact of the investments that we're making and the impact of those companies as well. So sometimes just really even asking the questions and expecting that level of reporting back from your portfolio companies is important for us to make sure we're aware of the impacts of the technology, but also to start to understand the trends, which are incredibly important as well as we work with other VCs, on whether it's co-investing in deals or sort of understanding where we're seeing a new set of issues arise, such as the case for us with deepfake abuse and intimate image abuse. And so I think it really is this collective approach that we have to employ, but asking the questions and tying the finance to the response, I think, is an important step in the process that VCs can participate in directly.
Yeah.
I love that. And I'm going to be looking for the things that you and your company are investing in, Nia, because they sound like really good investments to me. I want to shift gears a little bit. I'm often in conversations with well-intentioned but uninformed policymakers who believe that watermarking is the solution to this problem. Hany, I have heard you talk very brilliantly about watermarking before in other contexts when we're talking about kind of the content authenticity initiative that Adobe is running and trusting broadly the media that we see online. Yeah. Can you please throw a wet blanket over this idea that watermarking will solve our deepfake porn problem?
Yeah. So first of all, there is no silver bullet here. There's nothing. Name anything, and I will tell you that it will chip away at the problem the way watermarking will chip away at the problem. So this thing has to be done holistically. There has to be tech, there has to be policy, there has to be regulation, there has to be education, there has to be enforcement. So let's talk about digital watermarking. And unfortunately, the conversation around digital watermarking is sort of missing some really important technical features. And I'm going to just spend a minute talking about that. So what a digital watermark is, you've all probably seen the Getty digital watermark, where there's a big fat watermark on the image to allow you to see the image, but not to actually use it. That's not what we're talking about. We are talking about what are called imperceptible watermarks, where you take a piece of content, an image or a video and audio, and you modify the underlying pixels and values just ever so slightly, so that you, as the consumer of the content, don't notice anything, but a little piece of software can read that digital watermark and say, ah, this was generated by Midjourney, by deepfake porn, by whatever, or it was not, okay? And so what's cool about watermarks is you're going to put content out into the wild, you insert this digital signature, it goes out into the wild, and then you can sort of flag and tag it and know what's what. The drawback of that is that signature that identifies it as part of the content, which means the adversary can rip the watermark out. And we have seen that when watermarks were tried to use to protect copyright rights. So in addition, and this is the part that gets lost in the conversation in the media and with policymakers, is that watermarking alone doesn't work because of this ability to adversarial attack. So in addition to watermarks, we also extract a fingerprint, and we've already talked about it, which is a hash. So if I'm in the business of generating content, I insert a watermark. That's what we just talked about. I extract a perceptual hash. And that way, when the content is out in the wild, if somebody rips out the watermark, I can still reattach the provenance because I still have the signature. Those two technologies have to work together. And if you leave one without the other, it doesn't really work. Now, does it, okay, we've solved the problem? Of course not. Of course not, right? Because there's going to be bad actors out there. There's open source. There's a really good question in the Q&A, and I don't know what time to, is what do you do with open source models? It's a great question, because I can do all the watermarking and fingerprint I want at the big tech companies, but somebody's going to create a rip off of this and they're not going to do it. And so we still have to be able to deal with that. So is it part of the solution? Yes. Is it the solution? Absolutely not.
Yeah, and the only other thing I would add there, thank you for taking everybody through that explanation of what it actually is, because there is a lot of confusion around it. The only thing I'd add is that most of the non-consensual deepfake pornography that we see today is on sites that say that it's non-consensual deepfake pornography.
Yeah.
And it's still getting thousands, if not tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of views. People know that it's fake. They don't care. The idea there is to kind of denigrate women, to subjugate them to something really humiliating. Which I believe Lee had a question about, what do we need to change culturally to reduce these harms of deepfake porn? This is something I think about a lot. And, on my good days, when I've had a positive interaction in the world, I believe all humans are good, but then I'll get a message in my inbox saying something horrible to me. And I wonder how we've sunk to the point where that is what people do for fun. So broader than just deepfakes, obviously, but how do we reduce these societal harms and kind of the incentivization toward this vitriolic behavior? Nia.
Yeah, it's such a hard question to answer. But what worries me as a parent, of a young son, and wanting to make sure that he grows up in a world where he respects women. Part of that, I think, is just really being intentional about what community looks like offline as well. I worry that the speed of technology, the ease of it, the rise of social media, for better or for worse, and many would say, especially for children, for worse, is causing this culture of loneliness, where people don't feel seen, where people don't feel in community outside of these online spaces. And it's creating a society of people that are disconnected, that are angry, and honestly, just like don't feel love. And I think that we need to do a better job in our offline spaces, like really, talking to people and asking, questions and engaging some of the folks, which, have really, and that has certainly been the experience with the film Another Body, these young men that really feel disenfranchised, which is, as I guess, a Black woman of color, wild to me, but certainly, a true consideration of people's experiences. And, so I worry about varying communities, but I really worry about these young boys who need more positive role models, I think, of men in culture that are stepping up and supporting women, have stepped up and supported women throughout like Me Too campaigns and other campaigns that really kind of centered victims, and also making sure that those victims were able to seek justice. And so I always kind of go back to centering those that aren't traditionally centered. And I think that in this deep fake kind of intimate abuse conversation, although lots of the women are victims, but I find that these young men are the perpetrators, and it's this culture of loneliness that we have not really figured out as a society of how to deal with, that has really created the conditions for this type of abuse online.
Yeah, well, I'm another boy mom too, so I really appreciate your answer. Georgia, do you have anything to add from your work?
Yeah, I think the thing I've been thinking about is, or just reflecting on is how do we, or I find myself doing a lot, is normalizing storytelling about this, right? And so I think things like the film, I think, embedded in what you're describing of like the role of community there, Nia, right, is how can we make it something that it's not like it needs to be all of our responsibility to talk about like developing empathy to these things, understanding what happened there, like recognizing that these are can happen to everyone and aren't edge cases that aren't, we have to make it about the people we know, right? The people, like, what does it mean to do collective care and community care, right? And having that be something that we actually make a part of everyday conversations. And so that kind of brings me back to like, what do we need to change about supporting all of us as we like grow and adopt, like, when I was in school, right, I think you learned some stuff about civics. Maybe you learned how to type, like you learned how to use the internet, maybe learn how to do internet searching, right? I don't think we've adjusted anything about how we teach adoption of technology and how it's changed in our lives. Like that needs to become a part of not just an individual conversation or maybe an educational structural environment, school conversation, but a community conversation as well. Like we have to talk about what we're seeing going wrong and what we could be doing, and just normalizing that as a conversation, no matter what community you're in, like bringing up those tensions, right? I think we too often put it on the marginalized communities of color in particular, to be the voices telling these stories. And it's like, no, it's also our responsibility as the allies in the space, or as someone who hasn't, like, we have to talk about it. We have to highlight these personas. We have to like make it something that everyone starts to consider. And it's just like part of our roles, right? As different scales of community, if that makes sense. So I think, yeah, I don't know if that, that will make it easier to then talk about it and mobilize at work, right? And to shift these practices and to like, because we're afraid to bring it up, right? Or we think it's someone else will, or it's someone else's responsibility, right? But it needs to actually be everyone's. It needs to be normal to talk about the problems and how we address them.
Yeah. Those are such great answers, bringing together aspects of information literacy, civics, community building. Once one of my detractors said to me that I made it my brand to be abused online. And I was like, well, actually, I didn't. I find it helpful to talk about it because I don't think that people recognize how widespread it is and the human effect that it has, and the fact that my life will never be the same after what happened to me. And I'm a very privileged person, and if it happened to somebody else with a different skin color or different ethnic background, it might be much, much worse. So that's why I do it. If that person happens to be watching, which I doubt that they're not. Hany, did you want to jump in?
I want to add something that's a little flippant, but I think the internet would be better if you can get punched in the face through your screen. I think the reality is people say and do things because there's no consequences. But the reality is there are awful people out in the physical world who do awful things, but there's a lot more of them online because there's no consequences. And I think if you could reach through the screen and slap somebody silly, people would be a lot better behaved. I'll add one more thing to this too, is that we need to put people like Andrew Tate in jail for the rest of their miserable lives. We need to start by leading by example that this is not an okay behavior. And that is that's actually should be easy, by the way. But other than that, I think these are deep, deep sociological, and I think Nia and Georgia did a good job of talking about them that I don't have solutions to. But I'm an educator, so I'm big on the education side. By the time I get them in college, it's too late. This has to start way, way, way earlier about how not to be an asshole online.
Not that it shouldn't also still be happening in college, but
by the way,
I think
I
really
don't disagree with
too.
you. I mean, their prefrontal cortex is still years away from being fully developed, so we still have a little bit of work to do.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, these are things that we've known about for a long time. Like we're talking about bystander effect in a digital space. We're talking about, I've studied urban planning, like Jane Jacobs, like eyes on the street concepts, right? Like, what does it mean to have had to, because it shouldn't just be the person who's receiving that comment or that
Yes.
harm to be responsible to call it out. Like, it needs to be other people saying, like, that's not okay. Right.
Mhm.
And that needs to be like how we interact online. And I think my question is, how do we design systems to support that flagging? You know, one thing is like to kind of come back to where I started or where I started talking about what would it look like if every social media platform made blocking a like first order design principle, right? Like what if they weren't like, oh shoot, we should also make blocking tools, but instead it was like, we're going to be the best platform enabling like safe spaces. Like that's our goal, right? Like how do we shift that value in that direction?
Yeah, and
Right.
there was some progress in that direction, I would say, around 2020, and things have all come crashing down since Elon Musk's acquisition of Twitter and kind of the broader political fallout of the degradation of trust and safety features across social media, which I think is going to manifest itself in this AI space as well. We are running out of time. We've got about 3 minutes left, and I'm sad because there are a lot of really good questions in the chat. Oh, someone says preach, 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 Hany. Andrew Tate, right there with you, Hany. So if you guys want to just take a quick scroll through the Q&A, which I think you can see, think of one thing you want to address in your closing statement. I like where we've ended this on a somewhat hopeful note about how we can all get together as a community and not only deepfake pornography and other deepfake abuse, but these broader online harms and the human aspects to that. But I want to throw it over to each of you to give us your final thoughts. If you can put a Q&A in there, that would be great. I will start with Hany.
Yeah, there's great questions in here, and I am sorry we can't get to them. Somebody asked, can we put the genie back in the bottle? Should we just ban it? And the answer is no, we're not going to be able to. There's no putting this back in. There's way too many billions of dollars, and this goes back to Nina's world too, is the venture capitalists are putting a lot of money into this space, and there is no putting the genie back in the bottle. I think we could do better. Somebody also asked the questions, can you tell the difference between deepfake and non? And the answer is yes, but at scale, it's very hard. So we could also turn this over to the adult industry and say, look, one way to identify bad stuff is to also identify the real stuff. And so you should make sure that you have consent, and you should watermark and fingerprint all your content so that we know it is real. And so we can attack this problem from both sides. It's not always about finding the harmful content. It's also about flagging the consensual side as well.
Yeah. Nia, over to you.
Yeah, I think that I just want to advocate to get more women and young girls in tech. I got into venture because it really felt like activism, and you're only really able to do that if you have great companies to invest in. And I just want more companies that have women in diverse leadership that are thinking about these issues and they're creating innovative and sort of generative solutions, not just for technology, but really for society.
Love it. And Georgia, go ahead.
I like plus 1,000,000,000%. But I think the one thing that's been, I guess, maybe bringing me hope that I wanted to name is we've been doing some work with the Women's Rights Online Network and Web Foundation and some other partners to run like collaborative workshops around developing like what would it look like for us to have perpetrator data sets or like understand the pathways to that, or like another project is around gender privacy evaluation framework for tools. Like how can we build all of the sort of accountability structure interventions that I think would allow us to be having more people at the table, like co-designing some of these things. And a lot of that work just gives me hope because it's about having more diverse voices at the table. It's about like working on all of these sort of avenue intervention points that can give us new levers of change as well. So I would say come get involved in that and like fund work like that, like bring the money to those efforts, right? Like help us make those things happen.
Right. Well, thank you all for joining us today. Thanks to the My Image, My Choice Coalition for getting us all together. And I think you've got a great discussion with Carrie Goldberg coming up. So stay tuned.